Hi, welcome back everybody to the New Perspectives on Ancient Nubia talk series. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to take a moment and actually introduce the Badè Museum's Associate Curator, Brooke Norton, who will give us a brief introduction.
We would like to begin by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huichol, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders, both past and present. There is no question that our society is posed at a moment of change. We see it when fellow Americans are unjustly detained, when our citizens are wrongly harmed, and when our communities are in the streets for months on end protesting in order to be heard. The Badè Museum of Archaeology and the Archaeological Research Facility, ARF, at UC Berkeley acknowledge the pain and outrage of our community members who bear the weight of existing in a society designed to work against them. We feel the devastation most keenly. Here at the museum and at ARF, we have been moved by the courage of those most deeply affected and the tenacity of those protesting for change. The Badè Museum and ARF stand in solidarity with the African American community. We join you in your calls for justice. Collectively and individually, our staff condemns the police brutality and systemic racism that has long been enacted against the Black community and other communities of color. It has persisted for too long. It has resulted in the unjust and premature ending of lives. So let us say their names: Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, and countless others. Let us as organizations be perfectly clear. Black Lives Matter. We lend our thoughts and actions to those who every day actively work to make this statement a living, breathing ideal, and to those who continually live the reality of racial injustice. Likewise, we lend our expertise to the cause by incorporating BLM-sensitive material into our exhibits, programming, and curricula. We know very well that this moment has been a long time coming, and we are in the fight for equality, justice, and accountability. Through this lecture series, we aim to raise awareness of Ancient Nubia, a vibrant region in Northeast Africa with a rich archaeological and historical legacy. Learning about the ancient peoples of Nubia is one way to decenter the usual academic focus on Egypt and biblical and classical lands in order to reconceptualize the past. Decolonizing our views of the past, as through the research presented in the New Perspectives on Ancient Nubia series, we hope will lead to a more just present and equitable future.
Great, thank you, Brooke. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Aaron deSouza, who will be our featured speaker today. Dr. deSouza is an archaeologist specializing in Nubian material culture and is currently a Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow at the Institute for Oriental and European Archaeology of the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna. His first monograph, entitled New Horizons, The Pangrave Ceramic Tradition in Context, was published in 2019. Aaron's current project, In Between, re-examines Middle Nubian material culture as a reflection of the complex identities and social cultural interconnections across Nubia and Egypt during the mid-second millennium BCE. Aaron is Nubian ceramic specialist on the Tel Edfu project run by Yale University, and has previously worked on excavation projects at Hierakonpolis, Elephantine, Aswan, Dendera, and Helwan, in addition to grant-funded museum-based research projects in Sweden, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Italy. Today, Dr. deSouza's presentation is entitled More Than Kush, Capturing the Complexity and Diversity of Ancient Nubia. So welcome, Dr. deSouza. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you to the Badè Museum and the ARF for inviting me to be a part of this series, because it's really great for, I think, me and for many other people that Nubia is getting a long overdue moment in the sun. So just give me a moment to share my screen. Whoops. Okay, how's that? Can we see that? Great. So as some of you would have seen from my social media things, that this will be my last public lecture as a Marie Curie Fellow at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. So what I wanted to do is to use it as an opportunity to make some broad statements about the project, but also to use it as a way to discuss how and why we study and approach the material in the way that we do. So there will be some results and findings that I'll talk about throughout the talk, but what I really want to do is to highlight this diversity and complexity of ancient Nubia, which has been at the center of the project, because it's that complexity that makes this subject so interesting, but it's also what makes it incredibly challenging. And so what I want to do today is to talk about those challenges and to discuss how and why it's so difficult for us to break out of these old colonial cultural historical frameworks we've inherited from the last century. Oops. What's happened? Okay, so the cultures that I am focusing on, as Aaron said in the introduction, are called the Middle Nubian cultures. And there are three of these called the C group, the Pangrave, and the Kerma traditions. They were all active in the Nile Valley of Upper Egypt and Lower Nubia, and a bit further around as well, between the years about 1850 to 1550 BC-ish, which is roughly contemporary with the late Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period in Egypt. I won't go through them all in detail because you can find more information about them in various books and things. But what I want to drive home now is that they were all defined and described and conceived by Petrie and Reisner in the early 20th century. So these are not ancient groups. These are modern constructs. And each of them was defined by a set of object types and practices, which is very much in keeping with the culture historical essentialist models of the early 20th century that dominated when Petrie and Reisner were working. So again, these are not ancient divisions. They were modern things that were imposed upon the archaeological record in order to highlight the differences between the groups. But what I'm trying to do with this project is to not focus on the differences, but focus on the things that link all these cultures together. Because actually you can see that there are, even just in the slide with this selection of images, you can see that there are a lot of similarities. And if we zoom in to a few of them, we can see that just from these objects, we can tell that there is some connection to pastoralism or some connection with cattle and livestock animals that connected all of these cultures. And this importance of livestock and pastoralism is reflected in their material traditions and their customs. So we can see that, for example, in the C group on the left-hand side of the screen, where there are cattle depicted on the bowl, but there's also this Kerma vessel, which has a ram-headed spout on it. We can also see that there are cattle surrounding the graves, that in some cases in the numbering in the thousands, around Kermi tumuli down in the bottom right there, which is similar to the Pangrave burials, where there are circular troughs around the graves that contained animal skulls, and those animal skulls are like this painted one in the center of the screen. So you can see that there are a lot of things that actually do link these cultures together and that cross the boundaries between them. In terms of geographic distribution, all three were active in the Nile Valley of Egypt and Sudan. And we can see that the C group was active mostly in Lower Nubia and heading up towards Thebes as well. The Pangrave is by far the most widespread of them all, and this is spread in terms of material culture, not necessarily of people. Mostly concentrated from Middle Egypt, down to the Second Cataract, and then also in the desert surrounding those regions. And Kerma, of course, is centered on Kerma, but we also have Kerma material culture turning up further north into the Nile Valley, into Egypt. So we can see now that the cultures were all contemporary with one another, but they also overlap geographically. So we can, from that simple fact, we can deduce that contact and exchange between these groups and peoples and populations would have been inevitable. We also know that Egyptian texts contemporary with this period show us that the Egyptians also recognized that there were various and multiple different groups and regions in Nubia. But those ancient groups that the ancient Egyptians identify, of course, don't necessarily correspond to what the Nubians themselves would have recognized. And again, those groups certainly don't correspond to the Middle Nubian divisions that were created by Petrie and Reisner. So we've seen this text here on the left-hand side of the screen in the first lecture in this series by Dr. Salim Faraji. And it's a text from the tomb of Sobeknakht, the governor at El-Kab, from his tomb at El-Kab. And in this text, he tells us about Kushite-led raids that were conducted against El-Kab. And in this text, he names 5 regions. So he refers to Kush, who is in charge, which is what we know as Kerma, and then Wawat, which is Lower Nubia, Kente Nefer, Punt, and the Medjar. So he names, Sobek Nath names 5 Nubian groups or Nubian regions, but we only have 3 Middle Nubian traditions. So from that, you can see that there is no one-to-one correlation between the groups that were recognized by the ancient peoples and by us in the 20th and 21st centuries. And if we go back to those distribution maps and then we plot those regions on the map that we know of, so Wawat, Medja, and Kush, we can see that there isn't really any correlation between the distributions and these regions at all. So we can see that C group is usually associated with Lower Nubia, or Wawat as it was called back then, but you can also see that the C group material culture is attested further north up towards Thebes. The Pangrave tradition is often equated with the Medja. We'll come back to that in a second because there's something I want to say about that, because it's a problematic thing. But you can see that the Pangrave material culture is attested way further than just what we think Medja land was. And same goes for Kerma, which is supposed to be concentrated in Upper Nubia or Kush, but again, you can see that Kerma material culture turns up elsewhere. So there is this disconnect between the historical records and also the archaeological data that we have. But to return to this issue of the Medja, and this is leading me into the next couple of slides, a lot of older scholarship has drawn a link between the Medja and the Pangrave, the Medja being the Egyptian term for these peoples from this region, and then Pangrave being the archaeological culture that was invented in the 20th century. I've never really been an advocate or a supporter of this line of reasoning, even though I know that there's been some criticism of that lately. But of course, there could have been a link between these two, the Pangrave and the Medja, that might be possible, but we can't conclusively prove these things based on the evidence that we have, because we don't really actually know what Medja means. The term Medja, the meaning of Medja changes over time. Kate Liska's written a whole PhD about this, and we've got a chapter coming out about it in the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Nubian Archaeology. So this is a problematic connection, and it's always been problematic, and it's indicative of the problems that we face when we're trying to marry the historical records with the archaeological records. And so the reason that I'm showing you this in this context, linking these regions to the distributions, is not to say that they are the same thing, clearly not. It's to show that there is a problem that we need to address. So if we continue with the discussion of the Medjai, they are a really good example for how Nubians are not just Nubians. We can't just call anyone from south of the First Cataract Nubian, because we as we've seen, there are all sorts of different groups and regions and communities and populations. But we know that even the ancient Egyptians recognized that Medjai could both be friends and enemies. Because we know that way back in the Old Kingdom, the Medjai were working as soldiers in the Egyptian army. We know that there are women labeled as Medjai on the sarcophagus of Queen Ashait. But at the same time, we know that the Egyptians tell us that Medjai were involved in these raids against Egypt. So we've got this conflict between Medjai working with us and for us, and Medjai working against us. But it also tells us that the Egyptians were aware already back in those days that you couldn't just paint everyone with the same brush. Nubians were not just Nubians. So we also then need to break down the boundaries that we've imposed, or not that we, but that other people before us have imposed upon the ancient record that we have. So the key points that we need to remember at this point are that the groups that we have, C group, Pangrave, and Kerma, were created in the 20th century. They are not ancient groups, and they're things that have been imposed upon them, upon the archaeological record. Those groups and their definitions are essentialist. They imply that culture is bounded and that it's fixed and that it's immutable and that it's got, clear definable boundaries, but we know that that's not actually the case. The archaeological record is also messy. And this is a word that kept coming up in a conference that I hosted in September. And this messiness doesn't really lend itself to fitting neatly into boxes in the way that we wish it would. It just doesn't happen. But also quite problematic is that our perspectives that we've inherited of Nubia are heavily Egyptocentric. They were created by people who had ulterior motives in wanting to make Egypt sort of not African. But in that way, if we separate Egypt from Africa, we're losing a huge part of the story, because we can see that these regions were really interconnected. And so instead of dividing, which is what this culture historical system does, we need to find ways that these cultures were actually interconnected. And that is what makes it more complex and more challenging. So to illustrate this idea of interconnections, I want to show you a series of maps that sort of schematically lays out where my brain is going with all of this stuff. So we'll start with the big division, which is Egypt and Nubia. Of course, bearing in mind that these terms are anachronistic, but that's another lecture for another time. But these two things are very often presented as if they're distinct cultural entities that don't mix, like oil and water. Egypt, we know from ancient texts and also from Egyptian ideologies that Egypt is the Nile Valley from the Mediterranean coast to the First Cataract, and then everything south of the First Cataract is Nubia. And we know that the First Cataract was perceived as this sort of frontier where Egypt ended. It's where the nome counting system started, moving north. So there was always this sort of divide. But in reality, if we look at the archaeological evidence, we can see that there is really a lot of overlap between Egypt and Nubia, because Nubians, we know, were always in Egypt. There are Nubian burials and cemeteries going way back into the pre-dynastic period. We also know that Nubians were involved in the military, they were involved in mining and trade, they were working as temple staff for Egyptians, they were doing all sorts of things in Egypt. They were probably living there for centuries. Conversely, we know that Egyptians were always in Nubia. There were royal expeditions during the Old Kingdom into Nubia, there were fortresses in the Middle Kingdom, there was a New Kingdom colonization. So really the division between Egypt and Nubia is purely ideological. This First Cataract was never really a frontier. And we can even see this reinforced when we look at the Egyptian words for various regions. They have this term Tarseti, which we've heard from previous lectures as well, which was used as a generic term for the land south of the First Cataract, but it was also the name of the first Upper Egyptian nome. So already the Egyptians recognized that the southernmost part of Egypt, north of the First Cataract, was sort of almost considered as if it was part of Nubia, at least in name. But if we project forward into the New Kingdom, we know that the Viceroy of Kush, which was set up in the early 18th dynasty, we know that he had jurisdiction over the region as far north as Hierakonpolis. So again, that's in Egypt, it's north of the First Cataract. So administratively, and maybe even a little bit psychologically, the Egyptians did recognize that the southernmost part of Egypt was actually sort of Nubia, or that this region was some kind of overlap between the two. And then we can even add more layers onto this. We can divide Egypt into Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. We can divide Nubia into Lower Nubia and Lower Nubia, which is Walwat, or Upper Nubia, which is Kush. And so this is showing that there's even more complexity. And we even know that the ancient peoples were also recognize this complexity, because in the story of Sinuhe, we're told that a Delta man would be lost in Elephantine. So a person from the south would not recognize anything a person from the north would not recognize anything in the south. So the Egyptians were also cognizant of this diversity and these differences in their own land. We can take it a step further again by adding some regions from the Eastern Desert, which we know from the Egyptian words Ibhet and Medja in the purple and yellow circles there. There are other regions which I could add, but I think what I've done here is try to demonstrate that all of these regions from the ancient texts and all of the ones that we think of in our heads, all of them overlap. So therefore contact between all of the regions and all of the peoples was surely inevitable, and that we can't really draw hard boundaries on ancient socio-cultural landscapes. But of course, as humans, we do try to do that. And if we superimpose the modern boundaries onto the map that I've just created with all the ancient ones, we can see that there is actually not any correlation between the modern boundary and what was going on back then. And in fact, the key point that I want to get across here is that Lower Nubia, which is in the pink circle towards the center there, is actually entirely in modern Egypt. And so we can then extend that to a consideration of how we approach this region as scholars in our disciplines. That when we divide Egyptology and Nubiology, that kind of reinforcing these boundaries that we know didn't exist and that don't work, but that we're also trying to undo. And this is a struggle that I've also had for a long time in Egyptology, where I study a lot of Nubian material, and I'm often perceived as not really being an Egyptologist. But that's a problem, because we can see that a lot of Nubia is in Egypt. So we need to think about how we think about our disciplines and how we perceive our disciplines and where their boundaries lie, or even if there should be boundaries at all. But to come back to this theme of diversity and complexity, what does it look like in the archaeological record? So I'll show you a couple of examples where we can see a lot of mixing and a lot of contact going on. The first one of these is grave number 7 from a site called SJE Site 410, which is located in the Second Cataract. So on the map there, you can see that little green star. And this cemetery was identified or excavated in the 1960s by the Scandinavian Joint Expedition to Sudanese Nubia. And the excavators identified this cemetery as a Pangrave and Kerma cemetery, but they noted that Pangrave and Kerma elements don't seem to occur together in the same unit. But I went to Sweden last year, and I spent a number of weeks in Uppsala at the Museum Gustavianum studying this collection, and noticed that, in fact, Pangrave and Kerma elements, or at least what we think of as Pangrave and Kerma elements, do occur together in the same burials. So here on this screen, you can see that the pot in the blue square is or has parallels from Kerma sites like Kerma itself and from Sai Island. The pot in the red square fits all the criteria for a Pangrave vessel, at least according to our current definitions. And in the grey square, there is a bead, presumably Egyptian, made in faience, which is inscribed with the name of the pharaoh Senusret I. So we've got three different material traditions in one intact burial in Lower Nubia. We've got a Kerma type vessel, we've got a Pangrave looking vessel, and we've got an Egyptian bead. We're not in Egypt, we're not near Kerma, and we're sort of at the fringes of where Pangrave is supposed to end. So how did all these three things end up together? How do we explain it? Does it mean we've got our classifications totally wrong? And also the bigger question is, can we or should we even try to assign this grave to any particular tradition at all? It could be a Kerma burial, a Pangrave burial, an Egyptian burial, or none of those at all. It could be something else entirely different. We can see this sort of thing again at the site called El Wadi, which is down in the Fourth Cataract. Again, on the map, you can see the little star. And this cemetery has a really mixed assemblage that actually seems more like a local variant. So this was excavated by the Oriental Institute Nubian Expedition back in 2001, and I went to Chicago in 2018 to study the material firsthand. And this material is quite strange. So here in the center of the screen, you've got these two pots, if I use my cursor, these two vessels here, which look like they should be Pangrave in terms of their shape and their technology and their overall style, but they're not really. They're sort of a little bit weird. This one over here looks like what most of us will be familiar with, classic Kerma beakers, those beautiful bell-shaped things. This looks like it's one of those, but it's it's sort of heftier than a normal Kerma beaker. This jar in the middle doesn't really fit into any type of category. And then this down here, whoops, why is this not working? This little thing down here, this piece of bronze or copper, is from a razor, which is a type that we find normally or quite often in Kerma burials. The grave, you can see also, it's not like other Pangrave burials. It's not really like Kerma burials. It's a pit lined with large stones. The burial is in a contracted position. I've obscured it there. So we've got this sort of weird mix of things that don't really fit into boxes. So nothing really fits into any of the boxes at all. So it seems like we're looking at some kind of local variant. We can also find some interesting connections if we look out into the deserts. So away from the Nile Valley, we're still fairly close to the Nile Valley, but not in the valley proper. And the one that I want to raise today, there are a number of them that I could talk about, but because of time, I just want to focus on this one called the Handesi Horizon, which is off to the west here. There's the Wadi Hawa, which runs off the Nile Valley there. It's sort of roughly between the Third and Fourth Cataracts. But this site, or the Handesi Horizon, is mostly known for its pottery. It's in fact named after the style of pottery. And what we don't want to do, of course, here, which I should stress, is that we're not trying to use pottery to identify culture, because that can always be quite problematic, because we don't want to head down that road of pots equal people. So we need to be careful of that. But pottery is also incredibly useful because it is so abundant, and often in Nubian contexts, it's all that we have. So it's really useful, but we have to be careful with how we use it. So here we can see with the Handesi Horizon that the decorative styles are very similar to some Middle Nubian traditions from the Nile Valley. So we can see that there's these impressed interlocking triangles, these incised diamond motifs, which occur in the C group fairly frequently, and also these sort of triangles with comb impressed decoration. Of course, we're trying to avoid reducing cultures to pottery decorations and pottery styles, but it's hard to deny there are some remarkable similarities between the Handesi pottery and materials from the Nile Valley. We can also see that it goes beyond decorative styles and starts to also head into technology and pottery making techniques. And so here we can see on the left-hand side of the screen some matte impressed pottery from the Handesi Horizon, which was found at the Wadi Harik, which is a bit further north, a little bit closer to Kerma. But the matting impressions are a remnant of the forming technique. So the pottery was built on a mat, and these are the impressions of that mat. We also find the same mat impressions, though, at sites in the Fourth Cataract. We find it at Kerma itself, and we also find it way, way north at Tel Edfu in modern Egypt. So we can see here that there is some kind of continuity with the technologies. I'm not saying that the people who made this pottery were in all of these places. I mean, to say that a person from Wadi Harit was living in Tel Edfu because you find the same type of shirt is a real stretch, of course. But what does seem to be moving around is objects and ideas and ways of doing things seem to be mobile. And this is another element of this particular period, is that there was a lot of mobility going on. People moving around, objects moving around, ideas moving around and being exchanged all the time. So when we think of that, we then have to ask ourselves, well, why is the Handesi horizon, if it's got all these similarities with Nile Valley stuff, why do we treat it as something separate? What we're doing here is sort of we're putting things into boxes again, where really we might be able to start to think of things being more common and connected. So from all of that variation, but also all of that complexity and all these interconnections, there are three things I think that we need to really stress here. There's, of course, a lot of things that could be stressed, but these are the three that I think need to be thought about. The first is that we really need to rethink the cultural divisions that we've imposed upon the archaeology of the Nile Valley. And the key word there is imposed, because as I said, the framework was forced upon the material. But like any framework, it can be taken down and rebuilt. The second thing we need to do is we need to widen the catchment area to include the surrounding region. So we need to look out into the deserts on the east and the west, and we also need to look further south into Africa. And the third thing we need to do is we need to really focus on the importance of mobility, because as I said, this period was characterized by a lot of mobility of people and ideas and objects. And so those also will give us some clues as to how things developed in the region. So now I've dealt with Nubia, I want to also turn north and look to the Nubian evidence that we find north of the First Cataract. And I say north of the First Cataract here very deliberately and not Egypt, because you'll remember that, as I said, Lower Nubia is entirely in modern Egypt. So to say that we're dividing Nubia and Egypt or Egypt and Sudan or whatever is a bit misleading, I think. So I'm focusing here instead on the land north of the First Cataract, which is that ideological boundary that we talked about earlier. So here is a list of sites where Nubian material culture or Nubian evidence has been documented north of the First Cataract. It's a fairly long list, but the list is not comprehensive and it doesn't actually denote every single individual site. So for example, at Mostageda, there was something like 8 places where Nubian burials were found. At Hierakonpolis, there are 3 Nubian cemeteries there. And of course, it only covers the period in question. There is other Nubian evidence from other periods from different places. The Nubian cemeteries, there's dozens of them in Egypt. They range in size from isolated burials to cemeteries of more than 100 graves. We also have Nubian evidence in Egyptian settlement contexts, from the Delta down to the First Cataract at Elephantina, and also out into the Oases and over to the Red Sea coast. We also have Nubian material culture that appears in otherwise Egyptian burials, in Egyptian tombs. So for example, we have Nubian pottery occurring at tombs at Drab el-Naga. We have painted animal skulls like the ones we saw for the Pangrave occurring in tombs at Deir Bersha. So there's all sorts of mixing going on, but the main thing is that there is a lot of Nubian evidence north of the First Cataract, as I said earlier. And in presenting this like this, I kind of have a bit of an ulterior motive, and I've sort of touched on it earlier, and that's to state that people who do study Nubian material culture like myself can still be part of Egyptology. Because in fact, and this is an admission, I've never been to Sudan. I've never worked in Sudan. I would love to work in Sudan, but I've never had the opportunity. But also, fact of the matter is that I've been too busy working with all of the material that was excavated in Egypt at Tel Edfu and all of the sites in Lower Nubia that I've studied for the last decade or so. And there's still plenty more to do with that stuff. So this is again me trying to get this message across that we can't separate the two. The two have to go hand in hand. And this map alone should prove that the stories of Egypt and Nubia are completely intertwined and inextricably linked, and that it's all one big complicated story. So now that I've got that out of my system, that little rant, I will look at this little square here, this little green square that's just popped up on the map, which is focusing on the region between El Kab and Edfu along the Nile. So it's a 15-kilometer stretch of the Nile, but in this 15-kilometer stretch, there is a lot of Nubian evidence. So at Hierakonpolis, we've got one C group cemetery, we've got two Pangrave cemeteries, we've got a possible Nubian campsite, we've got Nubian-style pottery from the settlement remains at El Kab, we've got masses and masses of Nubian pottery at Tel Edfu that I go and look at every year, except this year because of the coronavirus. We've also got a lost Pangrave cemetery near the Pyramidic Nemea. And remember that this is just a 15-kilometer stretch of the Nile, and we've got all of this evidence. So this is a really good demonstration of how intensive the contacts between Egyptianness and Nubianness must have been during this period, this late Middle Kingdom, early Second Intermediate period. And so all of this, I think, raises a couple of issues, or a number of issues that we need to think about and to address. And the first is that we're now confronted with this contrast between ideology and reality. That Egyptian texts describe Nubians as being vile and wretched and all these sort of terrible things. We're told that they were raiding Egypt, they were taking things, they were destroying stuff. But we also know that Nubians and Nubianness and Nubian objects were like an integral part of the fabric of ancient Egyptian society. Which means that we also need to question, what is this duality that we impose on the material? What is Nubian and what is Egyptian? What do those things mean, and why do we think that they're different? To use a really simple single example, if we think about the Nubian-style pottery at Tel Edfu, I've given other talks about this, and there will be one coming up in the future. We've got about 1,000 years worth of evidence of Nubian material at Tel Edfu. So it's been there for centuries. Is it really Nubian, or is it now part of the Egyptian repertoire and a part of the Egyptian culture, if we can call it that? So why do we divide things the way that we do? And of course, we will also never know how the people that use these, we won't ever know who use these objects, and we won't know how those people self-identified, if they considered themselves Nubian or Egyptian, or even if that was important to them. But we also need to rethink these disciplinary divisions, as I talked about earlier. I had my little rant in the last slide, but if we can see that the archaeological record is so mixed and so varied, why do we separate things? We need to really be more integrated in how we approach things. So in order to remedy this and to try and come up with some answers, I organized a conference, as I mentioned briefly at the start of this talk, back in September. It was a 2-day workshop as part of the In-Between project that I've been doing for the last couple of years, and it was called Deconstructing Nubia. We had 12 speakers, and we all sat down for 2 days and we presented some papers on day one, and then the second day we all talked it out about what are the problems and how do we fix them and how do we move forward, what can we possibly do. There was a consensus across all of us that we need to change things, that things don't work, but we couldn't really get to the bottom of how and what would be the best way to do it. There was talk about, do we need to find new terminology? But then the question was, if we just replace old terminologies with new terminologies, is that just creating another problem that someone has to undo in another 100 years' time? Do we dispense with typologies and move towards looking at more functional aspects of material culture? Do we need to look at more theoretical approaches? So one that I'm working on with Marie Gatto is assemblage theory, which looks not just at the objects, but at the relationships that are inherent in those objects and between the objects. And maybe if there's time, I can talk about that in the question time. We need to take more macro region-wide perspectives and also micro object-specific analyses that look at specific object types in great detail. But most importantly, all of this work has to be done collaboratively. And that was the one thing that we all could agree on, that this job is too big for one person, it's too big for 10 people. It needs to be done by everyone who's working on this material, on this period, if we are to really get to the bottom of it. So to finish up, I just want to run through one last time this series of slides that if you've been to a lecture of mine, you've probably seen this series of slides before. But I promise for those of you that have seen it before, I will take it one step further, so just bear with me. So here we start with what things looked like 100 years ago, and even up as more recent as 50 years ago. We've got 3 Middle Nubian traditions, the C group, the Pangrave, and the Kerma. Each of them are completely self-contained, unique, bounded entities with their own material traditions and their own cultural traditions. They've got very clear boundaries and they don't really mix. But we know that that wasn't the case, and that there was, in fact, a lot of overlap. And the overlap isn't just between the Nubian groups, it's also between the Nubians and the Egyptians, but it's also with these other groups. I mentioned the Hadesi earlier, which you can see there linking up the C group and Kerma groups, but also There's this other thing called the Jebel Mokram and the Gash group from the Eastern Desert, which I didn't talk about today. But we can see now that the picture is becoming a little bit more complex. And so what I was trying to do with this project, and where I think we need to head towards in the future, is a picture that looks more like this, which is, rather than looking at these groups as being single cultural entities, we can now see that there's a multitude of variants of each group, that those variants probably have subvariants, and all of those things and subvariants interact and exchange with one another, with variants from within their own groups or with variants from other groups or other traditions. So the picture then becomes suddenly much more complex and diverse and colorful, literally. And normally this is where I would stop with this sequence of slides, but I realized in preparing this lecture that even this image is a little bit too restrictive, because you can see that the little subgroups all still have nice hard edges. So what I think we need to do is to look at it more like this, where the subgroups and the groups are all still there, the variants are all still there, but the edges are now less defined and they start to bleed into and out of one another. Because I think that is that's more like what was happening back in the ancient world, is that all of these groups were constantly in contact, constantly exchanging, and things were always in motion and always in flux. So the whole picture literally becomes quite blurry and much more complicated, but that seems to be the reality. And before I go, so that was the lecture, but before I go, I have one final exhortation that I want to make. And if nothing else, I hope that in this last half hour or so that I've been able to demonstrate that the ancient world was incredibly complex and completely interconnected. And so therefore, if we want to understand that complexity and that connectedness, our research also has to be complex and interconnected. So we can't pigeonhole ourselves into our disciplines. We can't just be Egyptologists working with Egyptologists. We can't be Nubian archaeology people working with Nubian archaeology people, and so on and so forth. We have to work together. We have to build bridges, because that's what the material wants us to do. And of course, we have to do this not just between the branches of the humanities, but we also have to bring in the natural sciences and anthropology. We also should work with local communities where it's possible to do so, who can give us more information about their home and their environment and their way of doing things. And as I said at the beginning, or sort of a few minutes ago, this is not something that one person can do. This has to be a collaborative effort. So we all have to work together, and it will all be very complicated. It will be messy. People will disagree on stuff. It might get heated from time to time. We'll all get things wrong. But in my opinion, it's this collaborative and this constructively critical, the key word there being constructively critical, that we have to do those things if we really want things to actually change. And so with that, I thank you all for coming along and for paying attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, well, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I think that was a wonderful way to end your talk as well, for a plea for more collaborative research. We have a few questions coming in. One person wants to know if any of the Nubian tribes were nomadic.
Yes. So all of them probably were to some degree. So the Sea group, or the Pangrave, is the most mobile of these groups, which is probably why it's so widespread. If you remember that map with the red one with this sort of big cloud. So the Pangrave tradition, or what at least we call the Pangrave tradition, seems to have been small groups of mobile pastoralists with herds of goats and cows and things. The Sea group also might have been partially mobile or seasonally mobile. Coma maybe also. But mobility was, which is why I brought it up a couple of times. I think that this movement of groups and peoples and objects and ideas is one of the really key things that we need to look into for this topic.
Were the Medjay a Nubian ethnic group?
That is an incredibly complicated question. It's really complicated. So I mentioned Kate Lisko, who's now associate professor at University of Southern California. Is it San Bernardino? Or California State University, sorry, San Bernardino. But Kate wrote her whole PhD on the Medjay, and we still don't really know what it means. So is it an ethnic term for a particular group of people? Is it a geographic term for people that come from a particular place? Is it an occupational term? What is it? The Pangrave and the Medjay have often been connected, but as I said, that this is such a problematic thing that cannot be proved one way or the other. That in the Old Kingdom, we see Magi working as soldiers. In the Middle Kingdom, they're doing mercenary stuff. And then in the New Kingdom, they become police, but sometimes they're also temple attendants. They're also nomads trying to get into Egypt. In the Seminar Dispatches talks about Magi trying to come to Egypt. They get turned back to the desert. So we don't really know what Magi actually means, at least to the Egyptians. But yeah, it's I guess, yeah, maybe, I mean, and also the whole idea of ethnicity in ancient Egypt is also problematic, as we don't know whether that was a thing that actually was important to them. So yeah, it's really complicated, and I'm not sure that I can answer it in a simple way.
I guess as a follow-up to that question, someone wants to know if some of the Nubian ethnic groups were Nilotic.
Yeah, so all of the ones that the three groups that I talked about, so the Pangrave, C group, and Kerma. So Kerma and C group were concentrated mostly on the Nile Valley. Pangrave, we think, came from the east, and then for some reason moved into the Nile Valley, and then sort of maybe some populations settled in there sort of by the late 12th dynasty, and they were there until the beginning of the 18th dynasty. But that's of course not to say that they were all in the Nile Valley. So I showed you those pictures of the Handesi pottery, for example, which has a lot of similarities in terms of technology and style to things from the Nile Valley. So maybe that's like another sub-branch. We also have one that I didn't talk about, which is the Jebel Mokram group, which comes from the northeastern desert in Sudan, near Kassala. And their pottery very often is completely indistinguishable from Pangrave pottery from the Nile Valley. So are these also two branches of the same thing, or are they actually different, or what's going on there? So yes, primarily they are in the Nile Valley, but that's, again, according to the frameworks that were given to us by Petrie and Reisner. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it was that way, and it doesn't really seem like it was that way anymore.
All right, we have some questions about the pottery. Are Egyptian deities represented on Nubian pottery?
Not for this period. Not that I can think of. I mean, I guess you might want to maybe possibly make a connection between the ram head on that ram-headed spout that you saw, and Amun or something. But that's of course that's a very tenuous link, and please don't quote me on that. I mean, I know that this is now on YouTube forever. Yeah, but no, apart from that, no, I don't think. But there is, not on the pottery, but on those painted skulls. In Pangrave Cemetery at Mostageta, there is a painted skull that has lotus blossoms painted onto it, which is strange and doesn't really occur on any of these other objects. There's also one from Mostageta that has a depiction of a Pangrave person, we think, or a person at least, on this skull. It's quite a big ox skull. It's quite huge. But the person is depicted following Egyptian artistic canons, so he's with his face in profile, with the two shoulders and so on. And he's also got a small text written next to him in hieroglyphs, but we don't know what that means. My good friend Julian Cooper with Hans Barnard wrote an article trying to figure out what this text says. So they don't have deities, but there are some Egyptian elements trickling into their art and styles of doing things as well.
Is the disciplinary divide between Egyptology and Nubiology changing? And is there still resistance among scholars who take a more traditional cultural historical approach to blurring these boundaries?
Okay, so the first half of that question, I think so, or at least I hope so. And I think now that in the last 8-10 months or so, this has become a really, people are focusing on this topic now, that, you know, we can no longer separate Egypt and Africa, that the stories, as I said, are completely intertwined. And I think that certainly with you know, the last maybe 1 or 2 generations of scholars and the current generation, we're now understanding that this is something that needs to change. But in terms of, is there still resistance? Yes. And I've, as I said, you know, a couple of times, I've been told that I'm not really an Egyptologist because I do Nubian stuff, which is why today I specifically pointed out that all of my work is in Egypt. So there is this there is a bit of a hangover from the last century of Nubia being African and Egypt being special. But I think we're now realizing that Egypt isn't actually that special and that it was just part of a very big interconnected ancient world. And not just with Africa, but with the Mediterranean, with the Near East, with Arabia, all these sort of places. So yeah, I think that it is changing, I hope.
How much evidence is there for East-West movement and exchange? So, for example, caravans or trading outposts?
Not a huge amount, really. And I guess because with especially with mobility, because it is often so ephemeral, it's hard to know. It's hard to make these sort of observations. So usually you find things at point A and point B, but you don't necessarily, that might look like they're related, but you don't have anything in the middle. So you don't know whether there is something, connecting those two things. I mean, we do have, for example, a lot of Pangrave cemeteries and Pangrave evidence on the west bank of the Nile, even though we think that Pangrave people came from the east. So they were able to cross the Nile. So there is a little bit of evidence for there being, star points and endpoints, but in terms of the routes that they took, it's anyone's guess. Although one thing that I can maybe say that might answer the question a little bit is that what I found in my PhD is that most of the sites where we had the densest evidence for Pangrave activity is usually at major wadis that come out of the Eastern Desert. So it's like that they were sort of settling near where these routes were that led to and from the desert. So you can draw inferences certainly about mobility patterns, but it's difficult because of the evidence is so ephemeral.
Are there objects north or south of the first cataract that combine characteristics of any of the Nubian material culture groups with Egyptian writing?
With Egyptian writing, apart from that, the cow skull that I mentioned, I don't think so. I mean, I know that Kerma, for example, had its own sort of sealing practice, but whether that is somehow related to Egyptian stuff or whether it's just that it's a Nile Valley practice is another question. But I can't think of anything that had Egyptian text. I mean, we certainly have objects that combine Egyptian and Nubian elements. So whether it's Nubian technology with Egyptian style or vice versa. But in terms of text, I don't think so.
Right, there's a question. What are the greatest logistical, i.e. publishing, funding, challenges to moving beyond the Egypt-Nubia binary that reduces the complexity of this region?
Okay, so the biggest one is funding, of course, but also time, just the volume of material that one would have to go through to do this properly. And this is one of the things that we talked about in the workshop is that is the only way to fix it just to go back to the start and go back through all of the material and forget about the groups we've got, forget about A group, C group, Pangrave, Kerma, and just look at the material, record the material, document the material, and let it tell us what to do. But then the problem with that is that a lot of the material that was excavated when they established these groups, so in the early 20th century, so Reisner's surveys and things, that material has sort of been scattered to the four corners of the globe, or it's been lost, or it's in a museum basement somewhere that no one knows about, probably completely unlabeled. So there's also that difficulty. And I mean, even just going to the UK, like you can go to one site that was excavated by Petrie, and that site has been scattered all over the United Kingdom. So you can go to one museum that's got one grave from this site, one other museum that's got another grave. So to put it all together is a really big job. So that money, of course, yes, but just the actual act of going and looking at this stuff again is really, really difficult.
So I guess as a follow-up to that question, what basic steps can researchers, publishers, museum curators do to begin to make doing this kind of research possible?
So I think, for me, I think one thing that would be really useful is publishing the objects just as objects or data or even archives, if there are archival documents. I know that, for example, the UK, they've got the Artifacts of Excavation Archives, which is really useful. But if museums could put objects up on their catalogs and make them accessible online, and not even to say that it's a Kerma pot, just to say that it's a pot and where it came from, and its excavation history, and then let the researchers do the work. For all researchers, I think it's important to publish data. Of course, working in Egypt, as all of us who work in Egypt know, there is a huge amount of data, and because we can't take that material out of Egypt and do it away from Egypt, it slows the process down a bit. But really, we really do need to just put the material out so that people can use it, and to try as much as possible not to impose I'm guilty of doing this. I've written a book about Pangrave ceramics, which I'm now realizing, in hindsight, if I could go back and undo it, maybe I would. But the material needs to get out, and so I would say that if we do it now, maybe don't force labels onto it, or if you do it very judiciously, and let everyone work it out together, I think. And it's all very pie in the sky and utopian, I know, but I mean.
Would the Egyptian Empire consistently think of Nubia as a conquered or subject territory?
At least in words. I think they did. I think that they, in their ideologies and their texts, they at least said that they did. But when you actually look at what's happening on the ground, I don't think it was ever really the case. So, like I said in one of the last slides, that the Egyptians tell us Nubians are vile and wretched, blah, blah, blah. They're there to be destroyed. They've got them on the soles of their sandals so they can trample them with every step. But then there are Nubians, they were always in contact with Nubia. Whether Nubians were living there, Nubians were certainly dying there and were burying their dead in Egypt. And importantly, they were allowed to bury their dead in a non-Egyptian manner. So the Egyptians were quite happy to have these people doing that, displaying their otherness in their territory. And I think that's an important consideration as well, is that then breaks down this whole idea of Egyptian superiority and dominance, and that rather everything was all mixed together.
All right, looks like there's one more question. Is there evidence of significant interaction of Nubian culture with cultures further south along the Nile? And how far south do these connections extend?
Along the Nile, it starts to get a little bit sort of thin once you go past the Fourth Cataract, but that's probably primarily because there hasn't been as much work done down there. There are other groups and cultures that we know of. For example, like Jebel Moya, which is further down past the Sixth Cataract, and I think maybe Michael Brass and Isabel Vella Gregory are watching. They worked down there and they gave a lecture about Jebel Moya a few days ago. But the drawing the links between Jebel Moya, which is way, 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 way south, and the Nile Valley is difficult. Maybe not possible at times, but it's worth exploring connections with regions like that, and also further out into the sub-Saharan regions, and also heading eastwards down to Eritrea, towards the Horn of Africa. And I think that's maybe where we'll find a lot of the connections that became or were connected with what we see in the Nile Valley.
Looks like we have one more. How can your approach be scaled up to encompass an even broader spectrum of neighboring groups that interacted with the Egyptian world that are studied in other subfields, so the Canaanites?
I guess the question means, like, how would we apply the same ways of thinking to other regions, I guess, is that? Yeah. I think we just have to do it. We can already see that there's all this Near Eastern stuff in Egypt and Egyptian stuff all over the Levantine, the Levant. And I was part of a workshop the other day for the Getty, and someone was presenting ivories from Persia that looked completely Egyptian, at least to my eyes, but they're not. So we can see that there was this interconnectedness. And also, like, I've got a good friend who's an archaeologist that works in Anatolia, and he found this Luvian stela that's got this winged sun disk on it. So it's like, there are connections everywhere. And I think that we just We just need to find them and explain them, but without forcing them into, this is Egyptian or this is whatever. It's just think of it as objects and look for the connections and the relationships between things and try to understand the complexities rather than just shoving a label on something. That's what I think.
Thank you again for sharing your fascinating work with us today.
No problem, it was a pleasure.